While the U.S. senators were in town, I interviewed Dr. Stephen Green, senior economist at Standard Chartered Bank, Shanghai branch. He analyzed the impact of current pressures on China's currency regime. The U.S. Treasury will make a decision next month whether or not to categorize China as a currency manipulator. What do you think will happen?
Well, the U.S. Treasury is mandated every year to look at exchange rates all around the world and to decide whether they're being manipulated or not for the purposes of improving countries' trade. Now, this all goes back to a 1988 Trade Act. So it's not just China that they have to categorize. Now, of course, they're under a lot of pressure. The US Congress is putting a lot of pressure on Treasury. Treasury Secretary Snow has come under a lot of criticism for not calling China a currency manipulator last time. So the stakes are very, very high this time around. The key question, though, is how do you decide whether a country is manipulating its currency? Exactly. And this is a very, very hard question to answer, and the Treasury knows this. If you look at the law, the 1988 law, it says very clearly that if you're going to call a country a currency manipulator, you have to prove that it's manipulating its currency for trade purposes, for making more of its exports, for selling more goods into the world. And in China's case, that simply isn't true. China's exchange rate now is moving from a fixed peg system to a more flexible exchange rate. And this is a transitional regime we're going through at the moment. So it's clear to us that China is not manipulating its exchange rate.
Now, let's say for whatever reason the U.S. decides to categorize China as a currency manipulator. What will be the impact on the RMB and Sino-U.S. trade?
Well, there's certainly going to be a lot of fluctuation in the offshore markets. People will be surprised, I think, if the Treasury does come out and call China a currency manipulator. In legal terms, though, there's very little that actually happens. The Treasury, once it's made that finding of currency manipulation, is mandated by that same law to start negotiations with China to solve the problem. Negotiations are negotiations. Maybe the Chinese leadership won't want to negotiate on that question. They may disagree about the manipulation. They probably will, and so they won't negotiate. So then it becomes a little less clear what actually happens. It's possible that the Senate might pass another bill on that basis, which would call for which will call for import tariffs on Chinese goods. But there are a whole manner of other things which might happen, all very negative, in fact.
But do you think that will bring some pressure on the Chinese currency or the currency regime in China?
Well, I mean, obviously it's going to be an issue which the Chinese leadership are going to consider. However, it looks to us that they've pretty much decided upon what they're going to do. The CNY is now more flexible. We're already seeing more volatility in the money markets, in the CNY spot market. It looks as though the market consensus is that the CNY is going to continue to gradually appreciate against the dollar. And this seems to be good sense in terms of economics, because it's not having a huge impact upon the economy. It's not slowing down the export sector. And at the same time, it gives the People's Bank a lot more time to develop the onshore FX market, the forwards market, the interest rate swap market, all that infrastructure that needs to be in place before the CNY becomes more flexible. And so in terms of will a currency manipulation finding force China to revalue the renminbi again? No, I don't think that's the case.
Well, on a related note, the U.S. Senator Schumer and Graham have proposed a bill to impose a 27.5% tariff on Chinese exports to the U.S. Because they believe the so-called undervaluation of renminbi has brought China a great advantage in terms of trade with the U.S. How feasible is it to implement such a bill in the U.S.?
It's pretty unfeasible, but the senators probably understand that. The bill calls for these import tariffs, but even if it was implemented tomorrow, even if the Senate passed that bill tomorrow, it would probably be at least half a year, possibly even a year, if the president says so, before any tariffs were implemented. So there's a waiting period, a very important waiting period, in which China could further develop its FX reforms, which would stop those tariffs being implemented in a year's time.
What will happen in this one-year waiting period if this bill is passed?
If the bill was passed, then there is a 180-day period in which the Treasury is supposed to start negotiations. Now, if China wants to negotiate, then there'll be negotiations. If China doesn't really want to negotiate, then one would imagine there will be no negotiations. At the end of 180 days, the President, the Treasury and the President make a finding as to whether progress has been made. If progress has been made on China's side, then another 180 days start, in which we wait and negotiations continue. So at the end of a year, if there's been no progress, that we're talking about the American Treasury deciding that there's been no progress, then the tariffs would be implemented. But I think the likelihood of the bill passing is very low because I don't think it will be tabled in the Senate. And I think even if it was passed in the Senate, we already know that China is reforming its exchange rate regime, and the reforms that are going forward and which will continue over the next year would mean that those tariffs were never implemented.
Overall, up to this point, how do you comment on the currency reform in China? Do you think it's successful? It's within the expectations of the government and the people?
Yeah, I mean, we think it's successful. We think more can be done, and more will be done over the next year.
Very specific.
Yeah. Well, for example, we've now got an onshore forwards market. So if you're a Chinese firm, you're obviously worried, or if you're exporting goods and you're receiving dollars as your revenues in China. So you're concerned that the CNY is appreciating and the value of your dollar receivables are falling. So you need a mechanism to protect that, to hedge against that risk in the future. And you can now do that through the forwards market, which we have onshore. Banks like ours can sell you a forward contract. There are still some problems there, but we're progressing. At the same time, if you look at the interest rate market, now we all talk about exchange rate reform as a sort of external issue, but actually, if you want to develop a mature foreign exchange rate market, you need also to have a mature interest rate environment. And of course, in China, we have still some administrative controls on interest rates. Bank interest rates are controlled. The interbank markets are still maturing. But we're also seeing a lot of progress in the interest rate market as well. And the People's Bank, we know, is very aggressively attempting to reform this year interest rates to make them more market-oriented. So there's progress there as well.
Dr. Green added a further renminbi appreciation against the U.S. dollar will be expected by year end.